Greetings, class. We're back with another good question. Um, for the next quick write that I'll be responding to, from a conflict and peace perspective, why are human rights so special? And so we have a lot of different ways we can approach this question. One is that human rights are actually what we think people should be fundamentally given just by virtue of being born and being human. And that in some ways it's the most core thing for humans to fight for and defend collectively. Um, One of the other strategies that we could look at is that one of the biggest causes of conflict is actually when people have their rights taken away or threatened, um, and that many conflicts follow from threats or inabilities to survive or have to meet one's basic human needs. Um, and then, so the third part would be to look at it almost exclusively from the peace standpoint, which is that to have not just the negative piece of an absence of violence, but to have a positive piece of having structures or denying and preventing the structures that put structural violence against individuals, but of promoting structures that support peace and justice, that human rights are absolutely essential. So I'm going to try and outline a response at all three of these different levels before we move on to our next question. So if we start from the last one, which is that positive human rights are the articulation of positive peace, we can start to really examine what are some of these human rights that we're talking about. And so when we think of human rights, we're thinking about like historic struggles. Like it wasn't too long ago, all things considered, that we still had slavery in the United States of America, and it wasn't too long ago that we had segregation, and it wasn't too long ago that Donald Trump, the current president, had his family's business practicing redlining to keep people from certain ethnic groups from being able to occupy residencies in certain areas. And it's still ongoing that one gender systematically makes more than another, and it's still ongoing that certain ethnic and racial groups don't get paid as much for the same work as some other groups would make. So, which do we want to talk about? Do we want to talk about universal basic income, the ability to meet one's needs for survival and to be able to provide for their family and their family's well being as being a basic human right? Or do we want to talk about being able to have free will and being able to actually have sovereignty over one's own body? Um, it's not all the same, and we don't have a basic human right that relates to pay. And it's important to make it clear that while there are certain things that are set into law that have been codified, there are other things that people suggest we should all have that some people would see as basic human rights that actually we don't have, and we don't have them protected. So if we look at this last thing about income and pay, um, the Universal Declaration of Basic Human Rights, the United States of America has never actually signed into. The president that got closest to doing that was Richard Nixon. And the reason that he was prevented, or his advisors instructed him not to, was that there was a provision that people would have a right to work. And his economic advisors told him that a right to work would destroy the American economy because it would take away unemployment by giving everybody a job, and then that would lead to inflation, or it would prevent employers from having the ability to fire people, and that will employment relationship just wouldn't work. So we don't have a right to work. There's nothing that guarantees that individuals have the mechanisms or the means in place for survival. But I would argue that like that's crucial. That's absolutely fundamentally crucial that everybody should have the right to get by, to survive, to live, to be able to buy food, to be able to pay rent, and so forth. And it's not just an American issue, it's in fact more a global issue than American. But the idea that people could actually generate the means for survival is crucial, right? And many conflicts, going back to the first model that I talked about, many conflicts don't happen with people because they like to fight, but because they feel like they have to fight. So if instead of going from the purely peace angle and going to the purely conflict angle, most people will avoid conflict when it's possible. Conflict's expensive. Um, States have to learn this very early on. Um, Avoiding war is very cost effective. There are a few things, there are a few policy positions that are more expensive than the decision to fight, because violence is so poor at delivering desired outcomes, and it has such high costs, both in terms of human life and financially. You know, 17 years in Afghanistan is extremely expensive, especially when you consider it's not delivering on the promised outcomes. But when people die, people take that very seriously. Human life is valuable, and it's not just fiscal; it's moral as well. Um, but so when we're looking at human rights, what we're seeing is that when people don't have rights, when their rights are taken away, that is in and of itself a conflict, and the level of violation, um, the level of violence that's being inflicted upon an individual, the more we're likely to see and should anticipate escalations in conflict. Um, Lots of global issues right now, right? Human trafficking, right? Talk about the historical tradition of slavery, right? It was codified into law in the United States of America. We had provisions that would prevent restriction on the trade, right? Same as Richard Nixon wanting to protect the economy. Well, in order to have 13 colonies come together to form the United States of America, we had to have promises that we weren't going to change the way people did business. And part of that doing business, right? The country was built on the labor of others. So there's a big conflict, right? There weren't slaves who enjoyed being slaves, right? It was a denial of freedom, it was a denial of respect, it was a denial of dignity. Nobody chooses to live that way. Well, we still have slaves today, right? We have different versions of slavery today. We have sex slaves, we have victims of human trafficking. We have people that are forced to work in ways that they don't mean to, have no desire to. But another thing that's codified in the law is that, those who are serving jail time in a good number of states can be rented, um, and used to perform physical labor against their will. They have no choice. And so it's the modern slavery. And so again, so if we look at the examples of threats to human rights, we can come up with all sorts of examples of violence that's conducted against other individuals. And every time we visit these ideas, we can see that they're sources of conflict, right? Because it's one party being made or denied privileges that others enjoy. Um, so when we have threats to human rights on the broader scale, what we're seeing is a denial of some aspect of morality that is regularly recognized. And so this is the reason that it's particularly special, right? Because there's few things that are kind of more fundamentally and morally significant, right, than the the, the 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 steps that we're willing to take in order to see justice and peace in the world, right? When we see things that we recognize as being fundamentally unfair, we react to them. And we react strongly and frequently pretty negatively to the people who are denying those basic rights. And so human psychology says fight for it, right? And fighting is not always something that people engage in strategic ways. And the people who have rights denied to them they don't necessarily have the time or the means to come up with the best way to respond. They just know that they need to survive and they need the respect and the dignity to be provided to them. Um, so it's crucial. It's crucial because this is, if we deny people, right? If we deny people their basic rights, um, then we can anticipate fallout, and frequently very negative fallout. And and it gets back to the other questions, right? Especially of policy and so forth. Um, there are institutions, right? Neoliberal institutions, global institutions, transnational institutions that have been put in place in the effort and hope that we will limit the atrocities that we've seen in the past, right? League of Nations formed as a result of World War One, 100 years ago, where the level of violence and the death and the destruction that happened when World War One was fought, they thought that it was worth collectively uniting to respond in a way that they would prevent future wars. Now, the League of Nations failed, right? Clearly failed. World War II took place under the watchful eye of the League of Nations. And so the idea of, all right, revisiting the idea of never again, right? Under the League of Nations, Hitler's rise to power, fascism, authoritarianism, and it managed to permit the beginnings and execution of genocidal practices. So they revisited the idea, the United Nations come together again, and uh, so the states say we're going to work together to make sure that this never happens again. This is too destructive, and we can't allow this to happen. So United Nations then also does the same thing that the League of Nations did. They failed. And one of the showcase examples here is that in 1994, you see genocidal practices taking place in Rwanda. And the problem here with the engagement of the Hutus and the Tutsis is that it was intrastate. It wasn't across borders. It wasn't an invasion. It wasn't an occupation of another place, but it was internal. And there's two different details here. One is that this is falling right in the aftermath of this event in Mogadishu, where it's known as Black Hawk Down, and the intervention failed, and UN lives were lost, and it because it didn't play out, and because it was a blemish on the United Nations, it made them afraid, ultimately afraid to try to have like an impotent intervention all over again. Um, and so the people who put their lives on the line to get the footage of the atrocities out, because they believed that if the world saw what was going on, right, the violation of human rights, the bodies being hacked up by machetes, that they would be forced to act. Well, so the world saw what was going on and didn't act. And so this leads again to another kind of invention, if you will, which deals with the other challenge, which was that one of the principles that we've had historically is that states don't want to undermine or challenge the sovereignty of other states. So, in order to override that, which was a mechanism that kept people from responding, they came up with what they were calling the responsibility to protect. And the responsibility to protect says that the United Nations basically has a moral responsibility to step in and protect the lives of citizens at times when the citizens of the state aren't not being protected by the state itself. And with that mandate, they said we would have been able to make an intervention at a time when we could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives in Rwanda. So fast forward to just like 5-6 years ago, we see the United Nations having votes about what to do in Syria, but Russia's on the Security Council and they continue to deny or refuse and resist UN intervention in Syria. So, so we see this ongoing struggle, right? We're not able to enforce the rules that would protect human rights, but what's fundamental there is that there is the set of principles, this collective understanding that people have basic basic aspects and features of their life that they should be able to count on. And this would be things like free to, you have a right to be free from sickness and disease. You have a right to an education. You have a right to safety, security in your own home. You have a right to shelter. You have right. So you put all of that together, and this is fundamentally what we're talking about. We have conflicts because people don't have the basic access that they need in order to have a comfortable survival. And this is a big part of our development goals, is to make sure that we can actually push to get people to the part where their rights are being protected. We have conflict because people's quality of life is being undermined in ways that doesn't even permit like the basic tendencies of survival. And then we have the interests of peace, which say, look, we don't want to have direct violence. We don't want to see people being slaughtered in the streets, but we don't want to have the conditions that allow for the isms that take place, which prejudice groups of people or allow and promote the discrimination, which threatens the survival of large groups of people on our planet. Hopefully this helps you to think about the question, and I'll move on to the next one.